Hello? Yeah. All right. So it's kind of weird talking to you as an audience. There's like 15 people in the room, right? So feel free to talk normally. I have to use the mic because they're recording it. I'm Mike Acton. I'm Engine Director at Insomniac Games. And I'm here to talk about AAA efficiency and how we can make things faster. How we've done it, how you can do it, that sort of thing. What I'd like to do is answer any questions that you have. We can turn this into a regular Q&A session. I have some prepared questions if you don't have anything. But is there any questions anybody has to start with? Well, okay.
Well, I have one.
Yeah.
So, sorry, it's my job to ask questions if nobody has questions. So I'm not abusing the fact that I have the mic. Well, there's something that I found really like super efficient, and I was really impressed by it. But it was when I was doing 13 Nintendo DS games in a year, so that wasn't quite AAA. But and I wonder if you can do that in AAA as well, or if you've seen that, which is decoupling, just radically reducing dependencies between people, between jobs, between disciplines, and allowing people, like in our case, to create content in Word, and then later, just we would convert that into actual game data. And I know that's harder with like level data, but
yeah. Well, there's lots of things that we do. I mean, you have hundreds of people working on a title, right? So there's lots of opportunity for that kind of thing. You also have not just decoupling, but you have to get people to work together, right?
Yeah.
But an example of that would be you have designers who like to work in, system designers who like to work in Excel to lay out their system, but Excel is not your interface to putting data in the game, because that's not the general case. So in that particular example, a thing that we did is to create a script that basically pops up Excel, lets them do the script in whatever format they want, in Excel, and that converts that to our actual data format, and adds it to the database and does all the things. But that's sort of like, we look for those custom opportunities. So we wait for a designer to have already made an Excel spreadsheet that we're watching them copy from there to our input, and we're like, we can just skip that process and I can write a script to do that for you. So just looking out for those kind of opportunities is a big thing. We also have to work with collisions between people and trying to minimize collisions between different asset creators. So for instance, we have in our environment data, level data, we have things called zones, and the entire purpose of a zone is to allow different people to edit different parts at the same time. So it's layered physically. So you have, like, in any given area, you might have a lighting zone and a gameplay zone, and part of an environment zone, and part of an animation zone, and things like that. So all, you can have 4 or 5 people or more all editing the same physical area at the same time. So it's separated in these separate files. So there's lots of opportunities for stuff like that.
So how do you make sure there are no conflicts? Like the artist moves the rock over there, but then the collision geometry has not been put there yet.
It's not. I mean, in the case of like a zone file, it's not physically constrained. So they open that zone and they can edit, but they can see them all at the same time. So they know that they're moving it within there. There's certainly the possibility of conflicts. Like, people can absolutely edit it, try to edit at the same time. But all of these types of files we have marked as exclusive edit in Perforce. We use Perforce, for instance. So that only one person can literally be editing it at one time. And then we allow them to work out the logistics, the content creators to work out the logistics of how to separate them. And they can create as many of those as they want. So. Right.
So that would only work if you use a tool that allows you to do that on a sort of file granularity, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've put a lot of effort into integrating that kind of granularity into our tools, so that you can, you can manage that level of assets. I mean, if you have like an open world game, and a huge number of environment artists and animators and designers all working at the same time, you end up with tens of thousands of these files all running around, and so yeah, just managing it is a very big deal.
Okay. Anyone else want to ask something? No? Okay.
So, what's the most significant factor in improving efficiency? So from my point of view, most significant factor in improving efficiency is, before we get into anything else, before we get into any of the details, I think it's really leadership in the team. Like, you can't make your team better or more efficient with just technology. You can't do it, you can't force it to happen. You have to have good leadership on your team. And you have to believe that it's an important thing. You have to believe that tools are first-class things. You have to believe that efficiency is really a problem and something you can do something about. And you need to have people help push that through, or it's just never going to happen.
Yeah, I've seen that in a team where, you know, we had a list of features and the programmers like broke it down. But then I was like, well, okay, that's a list of features coming from game design, but I know for a fact that QA is going to want certain tools in order to test efficiently, or they're just going to be swamped by the testing effort. And there was real resistance, understandably, because it was too much work for too little time. So, but there was real resistance from the programmers to actually even consider that, right?
Right.
So.
Well, and I think speaking of QA in that example, right, looking out for those kind of bottlenecks is really important to improve efficiency. So if someone were to come back and say, QA has to be able to test this, right, in order for this to get out, the resistance of programmers in that case is a problem, right? And that's where you need the leadership in that programming team to be able to step in and do something about it. Because if there is legitimately not enough time to complete the feature and get that testing in, then it might be worth not doing that feature, right? Yeah. Cutting it entirely. Because all it's going to do is bottleneck the entire process. So somebody puts whatever the feature is, somebody puts something in there and gets to QA and they're like, this isn't fun or it's not working or whatever. By the time that gets back, because the testing process is then so long, by the time it gets back, there's no time to fix it, right? So without the ability to iterate throughout the entire pipeline, it's just a broken feature.
Yeah. So do you look at iteration and workflow? Because I think, you know, like, hopefully most companies would look at, okay, our content creators, they better have like a really efficient workflow, because, you know, that makes, you know, I think most people have understood that. But do you also look at that for everybody else? Like, you know, the programmers, obviously, I think they can kind of take care of themselves to some degree, but like I said, also QA or other people, you know, customer support.
Yeah, I mean, I think from our point of view, I mean, certainly as an engine team, we look at efficiency, we try to look at efficiency as a global function, right? Throughout the entire pipeline, throughout the entire workflow. And, you know, we can't really afford to just look at it from department to department or, you know, feature to feature. It's got to be, you know, does the sort of the whole economy of making a game, and what else does it bottleneck and where does it bottleneck, and, you know, what kind of problems does it happen? And that extends beyond the initial sort of development stage as well. You have patching and, you know, post content to worry about as well, and how well can people iterate on that, and how quickly can they do that without, needing a lot of time. Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely a global function. You're definitely looking at everything, including QA. We also focus on our internal QA as well, not just game QA, but tools and engine QA. Right. I think, you know, instability is one of the things that can bring down iteration time the fastest, right? Tools crash, people don't know what to expect, game is broken, the tools are broken, whatever. That can bring down iteration time faster than anything. And so we try to have a sort of regular cadence of tools releases so that people know when things are coming out. And that gives us also time to prepare to test before those things come out. We have QA embedded in the engine team. Not a lot. I mean, we have 3 people at this point, which is huge for us, who then can test, go through a test plan on the tools, test everything with the game, spend a few days doing that before the tools are actually released. And that, I think, has brought huge dividends in terms of iteration time of the whole studio, because there's a little bit more stability.
Yeah. Have you found, because, I assume Insomniac, like most studios, has gone from small to big. Have you found like size-wise, there are certain sweet spots where, like, if you're like 30 people, then you would really like to have someone dedicated, but you can't spare it. But then, like, if you're at like 100 or 200, then certainly it becomes easier. Or
yeah, I think that at the point when really it's kind of also the number of projects you have going on and the number of different stages of those projects that you're in. And I think when we found that we were, we're having 4 or 5 projects all at different pipeline stages at the same time, 2 studios and a couple of hundred people, at that point, we definitely needed embedded QA on the engine team. Before that, when you're working on more like one project at a time, and it's a little bit more focused, is less of an issue. But when you're juggling that many things, it's just it just becomes absolutely necessary.
Right. To come back to leadership, does anyone else want to? Yes, sorry, but to come back to leadership. So I've heard you talk about leadership, and I've seen some other talks about company cultures, and it always seems to me like, well, yes, if you're already that company that has this great culture, then leadership is just this thing where you're like, I don't know, that seems easier. And if you're inside a company, which I've been in a few where the leadership is not that great, then it's actually very hard to change that. How was that in Insomniac? Was it? I guess to some degree the conditions were always good for good leadership.
I think so. I mean, I think it's probably true that at least the conditions were ready, and have always been a little bit ready, and the owners were always very open to that kind of thing. But I have also worked at other places where the conditions weren't as good, but I think there's always room for it. I think that in the culture of the studio may resist, somebody to come in and just try to declare how things are going to be, and really, try to make radical changes in a very short period of time. But no matter where you are, I think you can shift the boat, right? I think you can make moves, and I think you can, set a good example, and I think you can sort of try to head people in the right direction. Ultimately, it's about how much, it's sort of the effort reward for you personally, right? How much do you want to put into your own leadership, and how much effort you want to put in there. And if it's not worth it to you, you should probably leave, to be honest, right? But if it is worth it to you and you think you can make a difference, then you should be doing it.
What I've personally noticed is that there have been cases, and I don't know if they're necessarily related to efficiency, but where I felt like, well, I should really speak out now and say that I think this is wrong, and because I feel that's one of the best ways to sort of change a company culture is to actually, especially if you're in a leadership role, to go like, well, no. But in some cases, I found that easy. Like when I tell people go, "Oh, free-to-play sucks," and they're like, "Well, yeah, but that's our bread and butter." So no, this is why free-to-play is not that sucky as you might think, for instance. But in other cases, I found that like, oh, well, everybody seems happy with this opinion they have, but I think it's the wrong opinion, and now I have to like tell everybody, I have to be So I felt this fear, and of not wanting to, speak out about certain things. And do you think that's normal? But also, do you think that's like a big factor in people not changing company culture?
Without trying to psychoanalyze you.
I was asking for a friend. Yeah.
I think that there is, I think it depends on the culture of the studio. I think certain cultures reinforce the idea that it's okay to talk. It's okay to be open. It's okay. And you want it, right? And if you already have good leadership, they're going to encourage people to give feedback as critical as possible, because you'd rather hear it from your peers than hear it from some fucker online, after you release the game, right? You want to hear it as soon as possible. You want to get that data. You want to encourage it. If it's not a culture, if that culture, if it's not already in place, then I think people are a little bit uncomfortable because they're, not everyone's not doing. Why isn't everyone saying this, right? No one's speaking up. But that comes back to your being a leader personally and being able to speak up and sort of forcing yourself to do that, and recognizing that you can just take the authority to say something, and people will just accept it ultimately.
So again, asking for a friend. What if you're in a situation where sometimes you have to speak up and be show leadership to people who are your peers or your superiors? So where you cannot just at some level go like, well, but I'm telling you so. Look what it says on my badge. Therefore, at least pay attention. But sometimes you have to talk to people, like I said, who are your peers or superiors, and. What if you get into this thing where like you're saying like I think this is a problem, people agree that that is a problem, we maybe even discuss like how one could solve the problem, but then nothing happens, because I found it also to be very bad towards the team, because then you hear like, oh yeah, we have like this problem was brought up and we're going to do this, and then nothing happens, right?
Right, well, I mean, if you think your contribution ends when you tell somebody it's a problem, that's a problem too, right? I mean, your contribution doesn't end. If you believe in it, you keep fighting about it, right? You keep fighting for it. And the expectation that, given your opinion on one thing, that everything should be turned upside down immediately and fixed is probably unrealistic, right? Those things take time, and that's why you have to build momentum over time. You just keep fighting it. So, I mean, I think so long as you're not afraid to get up and say what you think and keep saying it in spite of resistance, in spite of things not improving in the short term, then it's a good thing.
Yes. All right. Okay, well, enough about my friends' problems.
You can't, is the answer to this question. How can I make better games cheaper without working hard? I mean, I think this is one of the sort of myths of efficiency. That there's a magic bullet, right? That you can just do and make the whole studio more efficient. And people look at things like procedural content as a magic bullet for efficiency, right? Why can't we just generate the whole world? And we don't need any artists, right? And it's not, honestly. I mean, there's some games that's suitable for, but most games it's not. Most games rely on a certain amount of handmade content because honestly, that's the reason you're there. Like, that's the reason for being for the studio, right? You have artists and designers and gameplay programmers and engine programmers and all that, and they're all there for the purpose of making games. Like, that's the reason why they're there. And you make money to support that habit, basically, of making games, and that's why everybody wants to be there. So the whole idea that there's a sort of magic bullet where you can just sort of like cut everybody out of the loop and make a game without them kind of defeats the entire purpose of the studio. As far as taking what you want to rather do, I think, is focus on what people really want to do with their job. What's the focus? As an environment artist, what is the thing that you love doing about the job? And how can we, get rid of all the other things? Get all the other things out of your way so you can just concentrate on that part. Or as an animator, or as a designer, or whatever, so that we're getting all the frustrations out of the way, we're getting all the small details out of the way. And sometimes you find that involves a lot of procedural content, right? Maybe I don't like doing all the little detail work on all the corners of all the walls, right? Okay, maybe we can fill all that out and you can just do the big brushy kind of things. So just focusing on the things that people want to do, I think, is the way to change that, without, just these broad sweeps, especially from a programmer's point of view of we'll just do it all and we won't need you, right?
Yeah. Does anybody want to comment on that or ask about that or pry the microphone from my hand in general? Right, so I think, what if you do? Let's take a game like Uncharted, a very heavy level-based game, and then take a game like Rock Band, which has sort of high-end 3D graphics, but those 3D graphics are not tied to the actual gameplay, right? Right. So I would argue that because they're making a different kind of game, there's a sort of crucial dependency on a production level they don't have, and therefore they can work more efficiently than the people making Uncharted. So I would say, like, the previous question, which is now gone, but if you have a certain organization built to do a certain kind of game, that's true, but if you start a new organization or just start doing a completely new kind of game, maybe you could do something significantly cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some truth in that. I think there's some truth in saying, if you're basically saying cut out the momentum, right? You have a lot of baggage and momentum that's driving the thing you're doing. And if you just say, look, we're going to do something so completely different that none of this baggage applies, there's some advantage to that because then you can start from scratch effectively. In these sort of fundamental decisions, you can say, we are going to do this completely differently because no one has any experience with anything else. Like, there's, an easier argument to be made for it. Where if you have this long history of making a very particular kind of game, then there's a lot of momentum for how people want to do that and what people do like about doing that, what they don't like about doing that. And it gets much harder to steer the ship in that scenario. Yeah. So I think there's truth to that. I also think there's truth, though, to, you have a studio that's sort of dedicated to a particular style or one kind of thing. Right. It has a very particular vision, right? And can build tools and build techniques around that vision.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and that obviously becomes an asset to the company, the fact that you have these experts. For instance, my wife works for Acton, and they're like the the experts in first-person immersive sims and first-person melee combat, and there's probably very few companies that can do that as well. Okay, I'm not impartial. I agree, but still, they always wanted to do this kind of game, and they always have for 15 years, and now they're like super good at it, right? And I'm sure it's the same with Insomniac.
So, and a counterexample at Insomniac is, so traditionally, there's a lot of similarities between a game like Resistance and Ratchet and Clank, even though they look superficially extremely different. But there are a lot of similarities. They're level-based, progression-based adventure games, basically, right? And so we built up a lot of momentum and tools on how to handle that kind of thing. And then more recently, when we started Sunset Overdrive some years ago, we made this decision to do an open world title, completely different from anything else that we had done. So we had no tooling for this kind of thing. We had no experience with managing that kind of asset stream. And so there's a lot of work involved in undoing all of the sort of fundamental decisions that we had made previously and all the assumptions that were built into the tools and built into the engine about how things were going to work like that. So yes, that's a price you pay for that kind of specialization, right? Is when you do change your mind, it costs more.
Yeah. So how did you go about that? How did you consciously, realize? Well, I assume you did. Like, well, it's going to be new ground. So did you build prototypes of tools and workflows as well as for the game, or?
Yeah, I mean, it was immediately an obvious thing. Like, it was immediately obvious that we were not tooled for this, right? For this kind of environment creation. So what we really did was talk to other studios that had done open world titles and quizzed them basically. What kind of experience did you have? What problems did you encounter? So we could skip, hopefully, the first few years of hard lessons and go straight to the harder lessons.
Right. So can I imagine it as like, shooting an email to a guy or is it like actually maybe setting up a visit, or
Yeah, both those things. I mean, we would shoot emails out, and then we would just have some people fly out to various studios. We have friends at studios and things. So yeah, I mean, it's a small industry. People, you just go out and visit them and ask.
Yeah, but at the same time, there's also a lot of secrecy the last 10 years or so. So.
Yeah,
like I'm sure if I went to Rockstar North, they'd kick me out, for instance.
I think certain studios are secretive. I think that the vast majority of studios, though, are fairly open, especially with the right partners. If they have a fairly good working relationship with somebody, people are generally open. And if there's no press around, people tend to be more open, right? Or no opportunity for that. And I think from our point of view, we're still an independent studio, so there's a little bit of us being able to talk to other independent studios and wanting to share experience, because we do have to compete with these very large publisher-owned studios. So I think there's a sense of shared purpose amongst some independent studios.
Makes sense. All right. Does anybody want to add something to that or ask about it? No? Okay.
So I think we touched on this. And the answer is the short answer is you can't radically change everything immediately. And the expectation that will happen is unrealistic, and I think also the source of a lot of people's frustration. I think this is a common question that people have, especially when they're talking about efficiency, is how do they know where to start? There's lots of problems. I'm walking to a studio, I see lots of problems, lots of inefficiencies. Virtually every department can benefit from something, but you only have finite resources, right? So how do you know what you should be working on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because what I have seen and have sort of lived myself is that you go like, well, you see a lot of low-hanging fruit, so you start picking fruit, but then like 6 months later, you realize that that it was higher fruit that was,
right.
Yeah, well, the metaphor breaks down there, but yeah. So how do you know?
I think that you take time to analyze, I think is the real question. I don't think there's any way of working around that. You measure. Mm-hmm. And you realize that the loudest person is not the person that you should, not the person that you should be supporting, right? And just not by the measure of their loudness. Mm-hmm. And that you're going to have to accept as part of this process of improving efficiency that you have to say no. that some people are going to be frustrated with the thing that they're working on, and that is absolutely not going to be the thing that benefits the studio the most. So they're going to have to just live with that for now. So being able to say no and look for the thing that will benefit the studio as a whole the most. So looking for measuring those production workflow pipeline bottlenecks and saying this literally takes us a week to do this. And so that brings the whole pipeline iteration time down to a week to make this one change, right? That's the thing you should concentrate on most. So measuring and just looking for those big global studio-wide efficiency problems first.
So in the process of that, do you ever hit any like, well, this level artist can do it in 2 days, but this other one needs like 7 days? You know, is there that dimension as well of measuring?
Sure, I mean, there's definitely individual variation, and then there's there's iteration time issues that have nothing to do with the tools either, right? There's people who just sort of will sit and tweak their thing. No matter how good the tools are, they'll just sit and tweak it forever, right? And you can't fix that from a tooling point of view. That has to, again, that goes back to leadership, right? And it's about helping people understand what is worth their time, and that's scaling to fit. So you have A assets, B assets, and C assets. And you can then say something like an A asset is worth 2 weeks of iteration time. It's worth spending the time to make it look really good. Where a C asset, you need to spend no more than 24 hours getting this out the door, and then you never touch it again, kind of thing. And so spending time and making those expectations really clear to people on the team, I think, is worth spending that effort. And there's no tools cost, there's no engine change there. It's just a cultural change. But there's a huge benefit to iteration time just by making that cultural change and declaring what's worth what.
Okay.
Okay, so what's the first thing I would do? I mean, measure, as I said. I think you go in, you figure out you measure everything you possibly can. You don't look for, I think the key is to not look for the one measurement to rule them all, and I think that's what some people want to do. You know, how can I find this one metric that will tell me how efficient we are as a studio? And I think that's a fool's errand.
The Metacritic of efficiency.
Yeah, and I don't think that exists, and I think it's not worth looking for. I think you're going to have a hard time finding things that are worthwhile to measure in the first place. So, it's hard to measure just the time somebody takes on building an asset, because they're doing all kinds of other things at the same time. It's hard to measure, okay, well, he spent 5 minutes in Maya and then flipped to a browser and was researching some other things, and so that's really hard enough to measure as it is. So just measure what you can. So things like, if you have tools uptime you can measure, right? If you have, you have per force, you can measure how many check-ins do people do on average. So just measure everything you can, and then you work backwards from that. You say, what conclusions can I draw based on the data that I have, as opposed to spending all kinds of time trying to create one metric that you will never be able to actually work.
There's a guy called Gerald Weinberg, and he ostensibly writes about programming, but actually is writing about psychology, and he has really interesting insights. And one of them is that, whatever your biggest problem is, you solve it and you still have a biggest problem, right? And so this idea that you're never going to run out of problems, and that sort of takes also a mental shift to deal with that.
It's actually people might interpret that statement to mean when you solve your biggest problem, you'll still have the second biggest problem. Yeah. And I think the reality is the opposite. I think when you solve your biggest problem, your next problem is bigger. Because you solved your biggest problem, it gives you room to solve a bigger problem. You want a bigger problem. You want to be able to solve a more complex problem. Because right now, I think your efficiency problem is that you don't have a big problem. You have lots of little problems. You have lots of small problems. And when you're able to solve those, now people are opened up. The reason you want to be more efficient is that people are opened up to solve bigger problems. They can think about more complicated things.
So it's not like profiling, or maybe
right. Well, it's sort of the opposite, right? I mean, you want to focus on the bigger issues, the things that you don't have time to focus on now, because you're sort of down in the dirt.
Right. So you want to get to a state where maybe you're asking, like, well, does my game have to have a faster frame rate, or could I change the gameplay? Like is that what you mean? Like moving it to a higher level?
Yeah, or you can
Or-
say, you can start, you have designers who are thinking about whether or not something is fun and how they can, how they can change things at that level rather than, is this asset in the right place? And, is this thing crashing? And have I placed all the characters in the positions that I think they should have and how many hit points they have? We want them to be thinking about the problem space that they're most interested in, they can contribute the most. I think that comes back to us talking about, sitting down with each person and saying, what value do you think you can bring the most, right? What do you think your value actually is? And it's probably not in the, I can move the routes around and click a lot, right? That's probably not the real value. Yeah. So you want to get rid of that stuff and let them focus on the thing that they can really bring to the game.
Okay. Finally.
Hi. So when you do this analysis of where you have performance issues and all that, do you have a single role to perform that analysis, or is it distributed? And who does that? And
It's
an external person in order to avoid any sort of bias. Is that a consideration?
Well, no, it's not really that much of a consideration, to be honest. I'm not that worried about not being biased or biased. I have an agenda, and I think that's okay. Like, my agenda is honestly, I want to make better games, and I want to make them, more efficiently, and serve our studio. And I think that's fine as far as agendas go. But we distribute it quite a lot. I mean, I think it's especially for our team, for the engine team, it's important that it's not viewed as a separate job. It's not somebody's job to analyze this. It's everyone's job to analyze this, right? So if you're looking at animation, then it's your job to understand the workflow of the animators and how the workflow of the animators impacts everybody else. If you're working on, in rendering and environment stuff, it's the same thing. Not just their workflow, but how their workflow impacts everybody else. So it's part of everyone's job. Some people are much more suited to it than others, for sure. And so you tend to lean on them more. But you don't, for us, it's not a role. It's not one person. I think there's room for that, though. I think there's room for somebody who's, say, a usability expert on the team, who then does this analysis constantly and can bring that to the rest of the team, right? I think there's room for that if you can afford it. But if you can't, I think it's also fine to spread it around and get everybody invested in it.
Anyone else wants to add to that? No?
Common problem for us, anyway, is fixing up lots of assets all at the same time. We have, hundreds of thousands of assets. They're all, we have tens of thousands that are maybe constantly changing over a given week. Millions of check-ins over, a very short period of time. So when you need to do mass changes, how do you do them? And we have a lot of infrastructure in place to support just that kind of thing. You have so many people editing things all off individual directions that sometimes we have to just make these wide sweeps to bring things in line. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of infrastructure in place to handle this specific case. It happens so often. So we have scripts that we can run against our asset tree. We have all of our assets in MongoDB. And then we can run Node.js scripts against them and basically do this mass changes against everything.
Are those like raw binaries or the metadata,
We have all the metadata in JSON format.
Right.
So all that stuff is the simplest stuff to change. The raw binary assets are fairly limited to like vertex streams and stuff from Maya, geometry assets, and texture data from Photoshop or whatever. But even the texture streams, we have quite a lot of metadata that says how that texture is converted and all the different options there, which we can then script against all of that. So when that changes, then it changes for everybody.
Right, but I mean, you don't store the raw bitmaps in MongoDB?
No.
Right.
No, yeah.
Okay.
But we can change the configuration of how that data is converted. Mm-hmm. And just spending time to build up infrastructure so you can do changes against your whole asset database and query your whole asset database and be able to say things like, where is this asset used? Where does it come from? Who depends on it? Mm-hmm. How many times is it used? Be able to do those kind of queries is super, super important, I think, for efficiency. Again, it goes back to measure. You don't know where you're wasting time. If I can create a report that says this, we've built 10,000 textures that are only used once in the game, and most of the time, they're not the most important texture. Then we can see kind of an inefficiency there, as a studio, and that's something we can tackle. But without that data, we just wouldn't know. Right.
So it sounds like you have a really complicated build system as well for your assets. If you can like flag something like some metadata somewhere, and then it automatically propagates and I assume generates maybe derived assets?
Complex, maybe not complicated. Hopefully not complicated. But yeah, I mean, we have our build system sort of watches everyone's drives locally. So when you change something locally, it knows and can immediately rebuild it and pull up, push the latest thing up onto the game. We have HTTP streaming between the game and your local PC, so that they can just grab everything off your machine and get the latest stuff. We have all the assets that are then cached in a global server in the studio, so that if I change something, then that's propagated up to, even if I change how things are built or you change what an asset is, either one is propagated back up to the shared server, so that other people then can just grab that rather than having to build it locally. So yeah, it's a sort of like cascading hierarchy of trying to minimize that impact, but giving people the latest stuff. One of the questions that comes up, I think, for a lot of studios, and this is sort of a dividing line, I think, between some studios, is do we do live assets or do we have asset branches and let people be on older assets locally, right? There's advantages to live assets, and then you immediately break everybody if you break something, but then you immediately break everybody and it gets fixed, right? Yeah. Where if you have local assets, you don't break anybody, people are more stable, but you may not see that thing get broken.
Yeah, you get integration issues.
Yeah, right. So I think that's pluses and minuses both, and I think it's a tough call to make. We sort of went from the live asset path to the individual local asset branch path. I think we're sort of satisfied with that move, but I don't think that distinction. I don't think the advantage is super clear of one or the other. I think at any given moment somebody could make the argument for the other one.
I think personally I'd be very nervous if you have live assets but then no way of locking down everything for you're making a build that has to go to the printing press, or that's the final master. Doing those kinds of freezes I found are short of just yelling at everyone in the studio.
Yeah, I mean there's definitely advantages to having. I mean we have lots of asset branches constantly. For every demo, everything has an asset branch. So we have gold branches and DLC branches and everything. We have personal branches for people to test out various things. So that's clearly the advantage to local assets. But we do have those problems with people ultimately integrate something that could have been caught much earlier, and so you spend a lot of time iterating on something that's broken.
Right. How much sort of workflow support do you put in your tools? Like how much knowledge is in your tools about, well, this is a version that's in work in progress, or this is linked to an issue somewhere in an issue database, or this needs to be reviewed by this person, stuff like that?
So as far as QA workflow, we don't put a lot. I think that's something that we've talked about over time, is introducing more and more of that. And I think that's something people are very invested in, the idea of that, and we would like to do it. But again, it comes back to we have finite resources, and we have to figure out what is the best, where we can get the best value from adding things to the tools. And there just hasn't been a compelling enough argument that we could get the most amount of efficiency from our studio by adding that particular set of features, even though they seem compelling.
Right. Well, I've seen situations where it seems like 50% of AAA development is just going and talking to 15 people and making sure they're all in sync, and then making sure that everybody knows it, and then writing a summary email to everyone, and then making sure they get it. Just like a whole bunch of overhead where you kind of feel like surely there's a way, like if I could just flag this in the asset database,
I think that there's some truth to that. I think that we can look to companies like Alien Brain that have tried and failed at solving that particular set of problems. Alien Brain? Yeah. I think it's a much harder problem than people think, and I think it's also a very local problem. It's a cultural problem for that studio. We can all agree that happens at almost every studio, but how it happens is very unique, and who has trouble communicating and why they have trouble communicating. I think that's all very unique to the studio. And so, yeah, I mean, I'd look for, like, we try to look for other ways that we can solve those problems before tech.
All right, so from a team structure point of view, I know that at Naughty Dog, they say they don't have producers, and I believe them, but then I saw a presentation by a level designer, and he said, like, yeah, the level designers are the producers. They have to make sure that they get all the stuff that goes into their level. At Arcane, the systems designer are sort of the producers, and they have to make sure that their feature, like, everything comes in and comes together. So how do you do that in Insomniac, or,
Yeah, so we don't have producers either, but we do have project managers, in the sense that somebody's job is to, know where everybody is at and be able to talk to them.
Right, but at a high level.
Yeah, I mean, they sort of are tracking between departments, right? And so
Right.
looking at that kind of thing. So that's part of it, but part of it is also, we do have, each person is sort of looking out at the things that are connected to them as well. So we're a little looser, a little more ad hoc with that kind of setup, which means that some things do fall through the cracks and we have to chase them down later. Yeah. But I think it tends to be a balance of how much process do you want in your studio versus how much sort of freedom to find things,
Right. Well, I'm sure I've oversimplified both, Naughty Dog and Arcane, but what I liked about it is, like, making the responsibility clear sort of shifts that whole, you're no longer relying on a process to make sure that the artist gives you the right thing. It's your job and you have to chase it up, right? So I thought that was kind of an interesting cultural solution, kind of, to making sure people do the right thing in the right order, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, making expectations clear is always a good thing, and that's always a good place to start. So I think a trap often is to make things over generic or to try and feature-proof them, especially for programmers and engine and tools developers. How can I just make this solve all the problems forever, right? And I think you end up wasting a lot of time doing that. I think the truth is that if you're building something in-house, in order to focus on efficiency, you should be building focusing on the thing that you could uniquely do better than anyone else. That I know I can do this only because that I'm part of the studio. I have unique domain knowledge of the studio. That means that I can do something. There's no way I can drop this particular tool into any other studio because no other studio works like this. I think focusing on those kind of things are the things that help your efficiency the most. Even if you're not a middleware developer, focus on the things that you guys uniquely do.
But so what if you flip that around and, you get to situations where, like, well, because we didn't think of obvious thing A happening 6 months down the line, and now we built this thing that cannot do it, right? I mean, because this gets discussed a lot in programming in general, right? You aren't going to need it.
I think most programmers get it wrong and try to be over generic, and they can't solve anything well because they're trying to solve everything badly.
Right. Yeah.
And so, I mean, what happens if the situation changes? Well, okay, then the problem changes, and you have to look for a new solution. But trying to solve all problems at once is a fool's errand.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've seen some cases this year in my work where, because I saw some technical debt coming, and I sort of slowly started refactoring so that would be reduced. I was then at some point, with a very minimal amount of effort, able to do cool stuff that otherwise I would have had to go, like, oh, you want this now? Well, yeah, that's going to take me a month to refactor all the...
Well, there's a difference between using experience to anticipate a problem that you're pretty sure will come, and trying to solve problems that you have no evidence to believe are actual real problems.
Okay, yeah, all right. That's true. Yeah.
I mean, we don't wait until all problems arrive and then solve them. Like, we can anticipate things, like we do often, right?
Yeah.
And we have a lot of experience to be able to anticipate things. This is likely to happen. This is likely something that we're going to have to do. We know how our designers work. They're going to likely create some kind of idea that doesn't fit into this. But it's not the same thing as saying, maybe tomorrow we're all going to try to make, Insomniac's going to make racing games. That's not really in the likely group of scenarios, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So we don't need to support that.
So is this related to, or it seems to me it's related, but maybe you disagree, to sort of short-term, medium-term, long-term thinking, whereas people ironically, I think people tend to do too much short-term thinking and not enough medium to long-term thinking. and and that's related again to leadership, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, knowing what your sort of mission is as a group or as a studio, and as a collection of individuals, why are you here? What is it that we want to accomplish over the long term? What, knowing your vision really as a group, I think helps you drive decisions. If you don't know that, if you are very much focused on, we're just focused on whatever this game is or whatever this, even before this demo or whatever the short-term view is, then yeah, you're going to be stuck sort of chasing your tail and moving from trap to trap over time. You really need a longer-term view.
Yeah. I have a friend who was in that situation.
So if you're all going to, when you guys leave, you can say, well, this talk wasn't what I thought it was going to be about, right? You have every opportunity to jump in and make this whatever you want. So now would be good.
Yeah, please someone else ask a question, because, yeah. There you go, finally.
Hello. I worked at a very little studio where on most projects I was the only programmer. And sometimes I found it hard to make room for improving the pipeline for the artist or for the level designer. So how do you make a line that, okay, I can do that for the engine, but now there's this feature and this feature that needs to be done, and I can't waste any more time on improving others' time.
Well, I mean, part of it is, it's not a waste, starting with that. Yeah. Part of it is language, right? Yeah. And it's always triage. If it's one person, or if it's 20 people, or if it's 100 people on the team, it's always triage. It's always saying, what is the most valuable thing? Constantly asking, what's the most valuable thing that we can do for the game, for the studio, for the future, right now? Where can we put our effort? Where is it worth doing? What's the best return on investment? Then that's what you focus on, right? It's just straight triage. If that's not the function that you're using to determine what to do, then something else is broken. So if you're saying, well, I have to put in this feature, I can't focus on workflow, I can't focus on the efficiency of the team because I have to focus on this other feature, recognizing that that process of deciding that feature should have gone in the first place might have been broken. Like, maybe you cannot do that feature and instead focus on workflow so they can get more iterations in so that the whole process, 8 out of 10 features with more iteration is a much better game ultimately than 10 out of 10 features and no iteration time.
Can you explain what triage is for the non-native English speakers? Even though it's a French word. But
focusing on, being able to sort of separate things into most critical to least critical and focusing on, and dead. Ignoring the things that are dead, focusing on the things that are most critical, putting your most effort into those, and then pushing off the things that are least critical.
Right. Who else?
Okay. Another question that comes up is, do you make systems for experts or for everyone? Because you certainly will probably have a mix in the studio, right? Some people are very expert in certain things, and they want a lot of features, and they want a lot of detailed control over everything. But you recognize that if you give that level of control, it will slow everyone else down, because they will have no idea. They'll be endlessly tweaking a bunch of variables. They won't know what the right things to do. You'll end up with tons and tons of assets with variables tweaked for no reason that you will then have to fix up. So this is, I think, a tough call. And this is part of what makes the end result vary by studio. If you have a studio that has a lot of experts in one particular area, say your studio is very shader artist heavy and they really know that space, then that's worth spending a lot of effort in. But that wouldn't maybe move to another studio, right? That same level of effort. So I don't think that there's a clear answer to this question, aside from separating it out and saying, okay, where can we get the most benefit? And we know that 9 out of 10 of our artists aren't this level of, or aren't experts in this particular area. So first, we're going to spend effort making the default answer the right answer most of the time. And so you leverage your expert to help you make the default answer. If you had no knobs, what should it be? And we'll get that right first. And then given time after that, focus on what the expert choices are. But I think the key is to have that default be right. I think especially for programmers, the tendency is just to make all the default values 0. And I think that's wrong almost all of the time. Like you could pick pretty much any other random number and it would be right more often. So, using the experts to help you pick values and picking a place to start will pay a lot of dividends, even if you don't change anything else.
So, sorry, you mean I have a tool, I have a whole bunch of checkboxes, and if I set them all to false, that's not the right thing to do?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
So to what extent do you make personalized editions of the tools? So if you had a team of 3 specialist artists and one guy has this one thing this one way of working that is really boosting his efficiency, do you address that at all?
Not usually. Sometimes we have. I mean, sometimes, especially if that one guy really only works in one area that nobody else is working in, right? And it's worth a lot ultimately to the game, right? That boosting the efficiency of that gives us a lot more in the game that we want. Then sure, it's worth it. But it's got to be a global function. We also have situations where one person works on one part of the game, but making them more efficient doesn't ultimately significantly impact the game, right? At least not as much as some other things that we could be doing. So we could say, we do end up having to say, sorry, you're one job and you are going to have to just keep sucking for a while we look at, this other thing was a bigger group. And so, yes, I think it happens that we end up focusing on individuals. I think to the spirit of your question, I think for the most part, we try to get people on board with a workflow, working together on one approach. It's going to be very difficult for us to support all the different 3D editors that you could use. We're not going to support Maya and SketchUp and a million other things. Like we support Maya, that's it. And so there's, we support Photoshop, and that's it, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think for the most part, we try to get people on board with using the same workflow.
So on the topic of defaults, default values, I tend to, when I add a bit of new functionality, a bit of new code, I tend to specifically set annoying defaults, forcing artists and users to address them, actually use them, rather than just going with defaults. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that, that serves, if talking to somebody in person and getting them to come sit down with you is not a real option, right, then you're basically annoying them into talking to you. And if that's your only option, then yeah, okay, sure, it's better than not talking to them at all. But more ideally, you sit down with them, you bring them over while it's in development, and you say, look, this is what I'm thinking. How would you even use this value? Like, would you actually change it? Like, what would you get out of it? Can I just pick one number here that would work for you and get rid of the whole slider completely, right? And so just spending some time iterating on it like that. I think sometimes, though, you do end up, pushing things out, and, just because there's so many things in flight, or somebody's, working on something else, and you don't really have time to sit down with them, or they don't have time to sit down with you, that stuff still ends up going out. I think at that point, you kind of just, you kind of just want to pick, we'll tend to pick the thing that we think is probably going to be right most of the time, based on our own experience, rather than purposely trying to make things bad. But, the point is all the same, right? To get the conversation to happen.
All right, and I think we've almost run out of time. So unless someone has a final question, I think we're going to stop. So thank you very much, Mike.